Tonight, in this podcast, we are looking at the quiet, invisible ledgers we keep with the people we love the most.
Mhm.
And I want you to picture a moment that might feel very familiar. Or maybe it's one you're actively dreading right now.
Yeah.
You're sitting at your kitchen table, it's late. You know, the house is finally quiet after just a really long day of noise and demands from work and kids.
Right, that specific kind of late night quiet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sitting there in front of you, just illuminated by that harsh blue glow of a laptop screen, is a bank transfer page.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You're about to send, a pretty significant amount of money to an aging relative. Or, maybe you're on the other side of that table. You're staring at a physical check that a parent just handed to you to help with your mortgage.
It is a very, very specific kind of silence in that room when those transactions happen. I mean, it's not the same silence as paying your utility bill.
No, not at all. Because why is it that handing a bartender $20 feels completely normal, light even? But a mother handing her son a $20 bill for babysitting her grandchild feels like a profound emotional betrayal.
Yeah, really does.
In that quiet room with the laptop or the check, there's this heavy, really complex feeling right in the center of your chest. It's this mixture of deep, undeniable love, but also this quiet, almost suffocating sense of obligation.
Right, the invisible string.
Yes. And this unspoken understanding that in families, money is just never just money.
Never. It carries a psychological weight that numbers on a screen simply do not possess. I mean, when you pay that electric bill, the transaction ends the literal second the funds clear.
Right.
But when you transfer money to a sibling who's struggling or, accept a down payment from a parent, the transaction is just the opening sentence of a very long, very complicated dialogue.
And our mission for this deep dive is to look right at that exact weight. We've gathered, honestly, a massive stack of global sociological research, anthropological frameworks, and behavioral economics data.
It's a lot of data.
It is. And we are going to explore the underlying economy of our most intimate relationships. We want to understand what is actually happening in our minds and our hearts when family and finances collide like that.
Because so often we don't have the vocabulary for what's happening in those moments at the kitchen table. We just feel the friction.
Yeah, that tension.
Right. We feel a sudden spike of resentment or maybe a wave of guilt, and we immediately judge ourselves for it because, we think love is supposed to be simple.
Let's unpack the human picture of this first, because I want to paint a vivid, recognizable scenario for you, the listener. Imagine you're a working parent. You're stretched incredibly thin.
As most are.
Right. You're balancing your own children's endless needs, the school stuff, emotional support, activities, plus the daily unrelenting demands of your career and, the constant maintenance of your marriage. You are already operating at max capacity.
Completely redlining.
Exactly. And then a new variable enters the equation. Your aging parents, or maybe your spouse's parents, suddenly need help.
And that could be anything, right?
Yeah. Maybe it's financial help to cover a medical gap, or practical care, like driving them to endless appointments, or maybe the situation escalates and they actually need to move into your guest room.
That introduces just a massive shift in the family ecosystem. I mean, the resources of time, space, and capital are suddenly being completely rerouted.
Yes, and you want to help. Of course you do. That's your family. But underneath that genuine desire to help, there's a silent friction. A very specific, exhausting tension. You find yourself quietly asking these questions you're honestly ashamed to say out loud, like, who pays for this? Who sacrifices their only free Saturday to go mow their lawn?
Yeah, the mental math starts.
Right. And if your spouse's mother moves into your house, do you feel this quiet, simmering resentment every time you walk past her closed bedroom door, even if she's perfectly pleasant?
Or, consider the inverse scenario.
Yeah.
You receive a massive financial gift from your own parents to help with a down payment on your first house. It's supposed to be this joyous occasion, right? You're supposed to feel nothing but gratitude.
But instead, and this is what we hear so often, why does it feel like there are invisible strings attached to every single dollar?
Yes.
Why does it feel like you now owe them a certain type of behavior? Suddenly you feel obligated to answer their calls on the first ring, or host them for the holidays every single year, or endure all this unsolicited parenting advice without pushing back. You didn't sign a contract, but you absolutely feel the debt.
What you're describing is incredibly common. And I really want to pause and validate that exact feeling right now. If you're listening to this and you see yourself in that picture, you might feel a real pang of guilt for even conceptualizing these relationships in terms of costs or debts or invisible strings.
Because it feels cold, right?
It does. We are heavily, heavily conditioned by society to believe that family is about pure, unconditional love. We're told that true love keeps no record of wrongs, and by extension keeps no record of gifts.
But the reality is, we all have a ledger in our heads.
We do. We really do. This feeling of carrying an invisible balance sheet, this quiet, persistent accounting of who has given what, who has sacrificed more, who owes whom, it's a universal human experience.
Wow.
It is the unspoken weight of family ties, and you are not a bad person for feeling it. You are simply feeling the tension of two very different, very powerful forces pushing against each other inside your own mind.
So let's define what those forces actually are, because I feel like putting a name to this changes everything.
It really does. On one hand, you have the profound biological and cultural imperative to care for your kin. We are literally wired to protect our lineage.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have the psychological reality of what sociologists call social exchange theory. And more specifically within families, kinship reciprocity.
Kinship reciprocity. Okay, let's define this concept clearly for the listener. What exactly is the architecture of this invisible ledger?
At its core, kinship reciprocity is the idea that every single social interaction, even within the purest, most unconditional bounds of family and love, fundamentally involves an exchange of resources.
Okay.
Now, when we use the word resources, we don't just mean tangible things. We aren't just talking about money or property or the physical hours spent caregiving or making meals. We are heavily factoring in intangible resources.
Like what?
Things like social approval, prestige, emotional security, compliance, and respect.
I love how you frame that. It's essentially a dual currency system.
Exactly.
I'm not just exchanging dollars for a down payment or hours of my time driving my father-in-law to the cardiologist. I'm actively exchanging solidarity and status. It's like there's the visible economy of money, and running totally parallel to it is this invisible economy of emotion.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. You're trading an emotional currency. When a parent gives a child a massive financial gift, they are transferring capital, yes,
Yeah.
but in the invisible economy, they are often purchasing influence or security against being abandoned in their old age, or simply the psychological comfort of feeling needed.
I imagine right now, sitting in your car or maybe walking your dog, you, the listener, might be having a quiet moment of realization. You might be thinking, oh, so that is what this is called. I'm not being cold or calculating or a deeply flawed daughter or son. I'm just navigating kinship reciprocity.
Yeah.
Just having the vocabulary for it strips away so much of the shame.
And it is absolutely vital to emphasize that recognizing this exchange does not diminish the love you have for your family.
Right, it doesn't cheapen it.
Not at all. Acknowledging that there is an economy to your relationships does not make those relationships transactional in some cold corporate way. Rather, kinship reciprocity is the actual structural machinery of how human beings maintain long-term bonds. Without this mechanism of give and take, relationships wither. It is the literal engine of social connection.
Before we dive deeply into the science of that machinery, because the behavioral research on this is truly staggering, I want to take a brief moment. If you are listening to this and you want to understand the deeply human experience behind your own behavior, we would love for you to subscribe to the Leone Patterns channel and leave a comment. Building this community of listeners who are genuinely curious about the why behind what we do, who want to look at these difficult topics without judgment, is deeply important to our show.
The more we understand these frameworks together, the more grace we can offer ourselves and the people we love the most.
All right, let's get into the science. And we're going to go deep here because the academic backbone of this explains so much of our daily frustration. You mentioned social exchange theory earlier. Where does this even start? Who first decided to look at human love as an economy?
It really takes root in the mid-20th century with the foundational work of sociologists like George C. Holmans, Peter Blau, and Richard Emerson.
Okay.
They observed human behavior and proposed a rather controversial premise. They argued that humans fundamentally use a cost-benefit analysis in all their relationships. We engage in interactions expecting a fair proportional return for our investments, whether those investments are our time, our money, or our emotional energy.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, but I have to push back hard on this.
Go for it.
Are we really saying that human beings are just walking calculators? That when my mother sat up with me for 3 nights straight when I had the flu as a child, her brain was running a subconscious cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
That feels incredibly cynical. It sounds like we're treating our spouses and our parents like a marketplace.
That is the most common visceral reaction to this theory. And it's exactly why we need to look at the nuance of what Homans and Blau actually meant. In sociology, the term self-interest is not synonymous with greed or selfishness or exploitation. Fulfilling self-interest is actually the guiding force of mutual interdependence.
Mutual interdependence, meaning the survival of the unit.
Yes, exactly. Let's look at your mother staying up with you for 3 nights. Was she calculating a financial return? Of course not. But was she fulfilling a profound self-interest? Absolutely.
Because she wanted me to survive.
Her self-interest was your survival, your comfort, and her own identity as a loving, capable mother. When two people value what the other has to offer, whether that's emotional support, companionship, physical care, or the fulfillment of a biological imperative to protect offspring, they create a stable bond by exchanging those things.
Oh, I'll see.
If there were no mutual self-interest, the bond would dissolve. The exchange of value is the gravity that keeps the relationship intact.
So it's much less about what can I extract from you for my own gain, and more about how do we keep each other afloat in a difficult world.
That captures the spirit of it perfectly. And George Homans actually broke this down into several propositions to explain how this behavioral machinery operates on a daily basis. 3 of the most fascinating are the success proposition, the stimulus proposition, and the deprivation-satiation proposition.
Let's walk through those because I want to see how this plays out at an actual family dinner table. What is the success proposition?
The success proposition is relatively straightforward. It says the more a particular action is rewarded, the more likely a person is to repeat it. But remember our dual currency system.
Right, it's not just money.
Exactly. The reward doesn't have to be money. If you lend your sibling money to get out of a jam, and at the next family gathering they praise you endlessly to your parents, highlighting your generosity and elevating your status in the family hierarchy, you receive a massive influx of emotional currency. You are highly likely to help them again.
Because the ledger balanced out beautifully. I gave capital, I received status.
Spot on.
And what about the stimulus proposition?
The stimulus proposition states that if a specific environment or stimulus led to a reward in the past, you will respond to it again. So, if family holidays are the place where you historically receive validation for your cooking, you will continue to spend excessive money and time hosting those holidays, even if you are exhausted. The environment is the stimulus for the reward.
But wait, that brings up a really interesting friction point. Because we all know people who do things for their family, get praised for it, but eventually they just snap.
Oh, yes.
They become deeply resentful of being the helper. How does Homans explain that?
That is where the genius of the deprivation-satiation proposition comes in. It states that the more often in the recent past a person has received a particular reward, the less valuable any further unit of that reward becomes.
Oh, that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
So going back to the parent who constantly praises me for every little thing I do to help them. If I'm over at their house every single weekend fixing their plumbing, setting up their internet, mowing their lawn, at first, their praise feels great. It pays the invisible debt. But eventually, that praise loses its currency due to inflation. It doesn't feel like a fair trade anymore for my actual physical exhaustion. The reward is satiated.
You hit the nail on the head. The perceived value of the intangible reward plummets, and suddenly the ledger feels deeply, painfully unbalanced. You are putting in high-value physical labor and receiving low-value, inflated praise.
Wow.
And this dynamic leads directly into another foundational concept within social exchange theory, developed by psychologists John Theobald and Harold Kelly. They introduced the framework of the comparison level, or CL, and the comparison level for alternatives, or QUALT.
Let's look at this framework. What's the distinction between the two?
Your comparison level, your CL, is your internal baseline expectation. It is the standard of what you feel you should reasonably receive in the way of rewards and costs from a particular relationship, based on your entire life history, your past experiences, and the societal norms you absorbed growing up.
I see. So it's essentially an internal thermostat for relationship satisfaction. If the temperature, meaning the balance of rewards to costs in this relationship, drops below my comparison level, the alarm bells go off. I feel dissatisfied. I feel like I'm being taken advantage of.
That thermostat analogy works perfectly. But here is the critical twist that Thibault and Kelly discovered. Your deep dissatisfaction, your thermostat reading freezing cold, does not necessarily mean you will leave the relationship or stop providing the care.
Really? Why not?
Whether you stay or go is governed by your comparison level for alternatives, your GALT. This is the lowest level of relational rewards you are willing to accept given the alternative options available to you outside this specific dynamic.
Let's map this onto a really difficult family reality. Say I might be stuck in a highly stressful, toxic dynamic where I'm the sole caretaker for a demanding, deeply ungrateful, aging parent.
Okay, yes.
My comparison level tells me this is wildly unfair. I'm doubly unhappy, my marriage is suffering because of the time I spend away, and I am receiving zero emotional reward from the parent. I'm freezing cold.
Right.
But my comparison level for alternatives is the invisible force keeping me chained to the situation. Because the alternative, the crushing, paralyzing guilt of abandoning a parent to the state, or the very real social shunning I'd face from my siblings and extended family, is actually worse than the current cost of caring for them.
That is the exact psychological trap. You stay in the exhausting dynamic because the cost of leaving is perceived to be catastrophically higher than the cost of staying, even if the current situation is objectively draining you of life.
Yeah.
It's a bleak calculation, but a deeply human one.
It changes the way you look at caregiving entirely. It explains why people endure incredibly difficult family situations for decades without walking away. It's not always pure, selfless martyrdom. It's a subconscious, agonizing calculation of the alternatives.
And to add another crucial layer to this understanding, we have to look past sociology and bring in the anthropology of the gift. Sociology explains the internal math, but anthropology gives us the cultural rules of these exchanges.
Oh.
I want to bring in Marshall Solins. He wrote a seminal book called Stone Age Economics.
I was actually looking at his work in our research stack, and it struck me that Solins doesn't view reciprocity as one big, monolithic concept. He doesn't think a gift is just a gift. He splits reciprocity into 3 distinct categories based on how close you are to the person.
That is the brilliance of his framework. He identified 3 distinct types of economic exchange that govern human interaction. The first is generalized reciprocity. This is what we typically think of as the true gift. The exchange is putatively altruistic, meaning there is no explicit, spoken expectation of an immediate return. Furthermore, the time and quantity of the return are entirely indefinite.
Like parents feeding, housing, and educating a young child. You don't hand a 7-year-old an itemized invoice for their groceries at the end of the month.
No, you don't.
You give continuously, knowing that theoretically, over the grand arc of a lifetime, the familial bond is maintained. The return might just be that the child survives and eventually has their own children.
Precisely. Now, the second category Solins defined is balanced reciprocity. This is a much more rigid, direct exchange of customary equivalents without delay. Think of how you interact with friends or colleagues. You buy a round of drinks, I buy the next round.
Right.
We split the restaurant bill down to the cent. The exchange is highly visible, and it's dominated by the material transaction and individual interests.
Yeah.
If I don't buy the next round, but the relationship fractures pretty quickly.
So generalized is indefinite and soft. Balanced is immediate and strict. What's the third?
Negative reciprocity. This is the attempt to get something for nothing. It's haggling, fierce barter, or outright theft. It's the most impersonal adversarial form of exchange, where parties are seeking to maximize their own gains at the direct expense of the other person.
If I'm looking at my own life, I clearly use all 3 of these. But how do our brains automatically know which type of economy to deploy in a given situation?
Solins argued that the type of reciprocity we use is dictated by a concept called kinship distance. It's like a concentric circle. We naturally use generalized reciprocity with our closest family members within our immediate household. Moving outward, we use balanced reciprocity with our wider community, neighbors, and friends. And moving to the outermost edge, we use negative reciprocity with total strangers or those outside our social circle.
This framework suddenly explains so much of our social anxiety, because if the absolute rule is that you must use generalized reciprocity for close family, it explains why it feels like a profound emotional betrayal when someone uses the wrong type of reciprocity.
Let's explore that. What does that betrayal look like in practice?
Well, think back to the hook we opened with. Imagine a mother who watches her grandchild for a weekend so her son and his wife can have a break. When the son comes to pick the child up, the mother hands him an itemized bill for her babysitting services, calculated at a strict hourly wage.
Oof. Yeah.
It feels shocking to even imagine. It feels incredibly cold. And Solins tells us exactly why. Because she is applying balanced reciprocity, a community or business standard, to a relationship that is fundamentally supposed to be governed by generalized reciprocity.
Right?
By demanding immediate equivalent cash, she's artificially increasing the kinship distance. She is essentially saying to her son, "You are a customer, not my child."
That is a phenomenal example. When the wrong economic rule is applied to a family bond, it signals a rupture in the emotional closeness. The transaction itself becomes a weapon. And that observation brings us to the final piece of the foundational science, the effect theory of social exchange, researched by Edward Lawler.
Affect, in this context, meaning emotion. The actual feeling produced by the math.
Yes, Lawler's research focused on the emotional fallout of these ledgers. He showed that the emotions produced by a social exchange are entirely involuntary. You cannot control them.
Wow.
When we successfully collaborate on an exchange with someone, when it is productive, fair, and follows the correct kinship distance rules, we do not just feel good about getting the task done. Our brains involuntarily attribute that positive emotion to the group or the partner. We feel a surge of solidarity.
So, if my sister and I pool our money and successfully navigate paying for our parents' emergency roof repair without fighting over who gave more, we don't just feel relief that the house is dry. Our brains take that relief and map it onto our sibling relationship.
Exactly.
We actually feel a deeper sense of love and closeness to each other because the ledger worked.
That is the mechanism of solidarity. But Lawler points out that the reverse is equally true, and it's devastating. When exchanges fail, when they feel deeply inequitable, or when someone uses the wrong type of reciprocity, we don't just feel frustrated about the task itself. We feel profound alienation from the person. The emotion of the failed transaction metabolizes into a judgment of the relationship. The ledger literally dictates the love.
This is a massive, complex architecture we're walking around with. We have this machinery of cost-benefit analysis, shifting comparison levels, strict anthropological rules about who gets what kind of gift, and an emotional attribution system that fires involuntarily.
It's a lot.
It is. I want to transition now. Let's move from the theoretical science to the raw data. How does this invisible machinery manifest in global, real-world behavior? What are the quiet patterns people fall into without ever noticing?
We can start by looking at a data set that completely challenges our standard assumptions about why families move money around. We're going to look at the shared data set, the survey of health, aging, and retirement in Europe. And specifically, the researchers focused their lens on Romania. They were tracking intergenerational financial transfers of 250 euros or more among people over the age of 50.
Okay, so tracking the flow of significant cash between generations, what did the map look like?
The data revealed that financial transfers flow overwhelmingly in one direction, downward. The money moves from parents over 50 down to their adult children and grandchildren. Transfers going upward from adult children to their aging parents were statistically incredibly rare.
I mean, on the surface, that makes logical sense to me. Usually by the time you're in your 60s or 70s, you've accumulated more wealth, paid off a mortgage, and stabilized. You naturally have more capital to spare than the 30-year-old child who's paying for childcare in a starter home. It's just a matter of who has the surplus.
That is exactly what the researchers initially assumed. But the data held a massive surprise. To dig deeper, the researchers used a statistical method called multidimensional correspondence analysis.
Wait, multidimensional correspondence analysis is a mouthful.
Yeah.
Before we look at the result, how does an algorithm actually prove anything about family dynamics? What is the math actually doing behind the scenes?
Think of it like a highly sophisticated sorting machine. Usually, if we look at financial gifts, income disparity is the loudest variable in the room. It drowns out everything else. This algorithm groups people based on dozens of other characteristics, age, health, proximity, employment status, and maps these variables spatially on a graph. It allows researchers to see relationships between data points by essentially temporarily muting the income variable.
Oh, fascinating.
And what the researchers saw was stunning. When they mapped it out, they found there were no significant income differences between the donors and the receivers.
Wait, really? So the parents aren't giving the money because the kids are destitute, and the parents aren't giving it because they are fabulously wealthy? The two groups share basically the same economic bracket, so why do it? Why hand over 250 euros to an adult child if that child doesn't strictly need it to survive?
Because the researchers realize it is a symbolic exchange model. The money is not functioning as a utility, it is functioning as a language. These transfers act as a minor insurance policy against sudden income shocks, certainly. But their primary overwhelming function is to create and maintain family cohesion.
I see it. It's the physical manifestation of generalized reciprocity.
Exactly.
The parents are handing over €250, not to pay a specific heating bill, but to say, we are fundamentally connected. You belong to me. I am looking out for you. It's the dual currency system in full effect. They are trading euros to purchase solidarity.
It is a brilliant strategy for maintaining the pack. And the reason this symbolic wealth can flow downward so freely in this specific Romanian context is partly due to the existence of state pension systems. Because the elderly have a baseline of survival insured by the state, they are freed from the terror of absolute poverty. That freedom allows them to use their extra capital for symbolic exchange to bind the family together.
That is a beautiful concept. Money as a binding agent. But if parents are using money to buy solidarity downwards, what happens when we look at two people on the exact same horizontal level? What happens to the ledger when a husband and wife have to share it? The societal assumption is that they just pool their money peacefully.
For decades, economists operated under that exact assumption. It was called the unitary model. The idea that a household is basically a single organism with one brain, pooling all resources perfectly and sharing the exact same goals for how to spend it.
Right.
But recent expansive reviews by CG Space on agricultural and development economics have completely dismantled that myth. Households actually operate on a collective bargaining model.
Meaning a marriage is less of a single organism and more of an ongoing daily negotiation between two individuals who often have vastly different priorities.
Exactly. And the data shows what happens when we shift the power dynamic at that bargaining table. When researchers looked at households where women actually control the income, the spending patterns of the entire family shift dramatically.
How so?
When women hold the purse strings, household spending moves heavily toward investments in children's education, toward more diverse and nutritious food, and toward preventative health care. Simultaneously, spending on what economists bluntly call adult goods, primarily alcohol and tobacco, plummets.
Wow. So the invisible power dynamic of who controls the ledger literally changes the nutritional makeup of the children's bodies. It changes their educational trajectory.
It really does.
But if marriages are essentially a bargaining table, that must create some incredibly complex, perhaps even secretive patterns of behavior. Because if you know your spouse wants to spend the surplus on tobacco and you desperately want to spend it on school fees, how do you navigate that friction without destroying the marriage?
You navigate it through intense information control. And this brings us to some fascinating behavioral experiments conducted in Tanzania and Uganda. The researchers set up scenarios to see how spouses manage windfalls. And what they found was that women are systematically, overwhelmingly more likely to hide income from their husbands.
Because the moment the husband knows the money exists, it becomes visible on the ledger and therefore subject to the bargaining table.
That is the exact risk. If a woman earns extra money from a microenterprise or receives a small bonus and her husband knows about it, she risks losing control of how it is allocated. It's not about greed. It's about protecting the priorities of the family.
That makes total sense.
It's almost like a corporate board meeting where one executive is keeping off-book accounts to ensure the research and development department. In this case, the children's health gets funded before executive bonuses are paid out. The experiment showed that women who successfully hid money from their spouses actually achieved higher economic and health outcomes for their households. They are protecting their bargaining power through secrecy.
That is an incredible aha moment for understanding financial infidelity. We judge it so harshly, but in many contexts, it is a survival mechanism for the family unit.
Yeah.
But the data shows it isn't always just about hiding money, is it? Sometimes the power dynamics require a much more complicated, almost theatrical dance.
Yes, because you are constantly negotiating with rigid gender norms. In some of these African village studies, researchers observed women participating in savings and loan associations. The woman would take out a loan, receive the physical cash, and then immediately hand that cash directly to her husband.
Wait, why on earth would she do that if the entire goal is to maintain control over how it's spent?
Because she is hacking the cultural contest. She hands the money to the husband so that he can be the one to physically walk into the clinic and negotiate the payment for health care with the nurses. She secures the budget through her own effort, but she utilizes his elevated status as the male head of household to execute the transaction effectively in a patriarchal society.
Oh, wow.
She gets what she wants, health care for her child, but she protects his status in the community. It illustrates the incredibly exhausting, multi-layered mental load women carry to enforce their priorities on the household ledger.
It's exhausting just contemplating the mental chess involved in that. You aren't just managing the money, you are managing the perception of the money and the ego of your partner.
Precisely.
Let's expand the circle outward again. We've looked at parents and children, and we've looked at spouses. Let's look at the absolute pressure cooker of the family ecosystem, in-laws.
This is where the ledgers often become the most destructive.
Let me paint another picture for the listener. This is a dynamic we see constantly in therapy and in life, a pattern psychologists call triangulation. Imagine you are deeply upset with your mother-in-law. She has crossed a boundary regarding your children, or she's demanding too much of your weekend time. But instead of confronting her directly, because that violates the kinship distance rules of respect, you tell your husband. You vent your frustration to him, and instantly he's caught entirely in the middle. He has to negotiate the ledger between his loyalty to you, his wife, and his lifelong loyalty to his mother.
It places the husband in an impossible, profoundly stressful position. And we see this pressure cooker documented clearly in a psychological study focusing on Korean and Chinese American daughters-in-law, or DILs. This study is captivating because it highlights a massive clash of cultural values playing out directly on the family ledger.
What are the two value systems colliding here?
You have European American ideals, which these women are living in daily. This system prioritizes individualism, the autonomy of the nuclear family, and positions the marital bond as the supreme, untouchable relationship.
Colliding violently with that, you have East Asian Confucian values, specifically the deeply rooted virtue of filial piety.
Filial piety, the absolute, unquestioning respect, obedience, and financial care owed to one's parents, and by extension, when you marry one's parents-in-law.
Exactly. In traditional Confucian structures, a woman doesn't just marry a man, she marries into his family's hierarchy. Her primary obligations shift to serving and financially supporting his parents.
Wow, that is a huge shift.
The study documented how these Asian American daughters-in-law internalize immense crushing stress because they are caught between these two irreconcilable ledgers. They live in a Western context that tells them their marriage comes first and their income is their own, but their in-laws expect traditional subservience, dowries, and complete financial prioritization.
The emotional toll of trying to balance two entirely different cultural economies must be staggering. The DILs in this study reported feeling constantly anxious, tearful, inadequate, and deeply resentful. They cope by engaging in intense avoidance strategies, trying to minimize physical contact with the in-laws, because the expectations placed on them are so heavy they feel they cannot breathe.
That's heartbreaking.
And we see this pressure reflected in stark quantitative data from South Korea as well. Research there shows women working grueling dual jobs, maintaining a full career in the paid labor market while shouldering the domestic labor at home, who are financially supporting their parents-in-law significantly more than their own biological parents.
Even if they feel emotionally closer to their own biological mothers.
Yes, the cultural duty dictates the financial flow, entirely regardless of emotional closeness. The ledger is governed by rigid expectation, not affection.
If we bring this back to you, the listener, how often do we engage in these silent avoidance strategies in our own lives? How often do we silently resent a spouse who, perhaps completely unconsciously, prioritizes their aging mother's anxiety over their own partner's struggles?
It happens all the time.
A quote from that study really anchored this for me. A woman was struggling deeply with postpartum depression, feeling completely lost. Meanwhile, her husband was entirely preoccupied with managing his mother's minor anxieties. The wife felt completely sidelined, invisible in her own home. That is the agonizing, everyday reality of competing kinship obligations. It is a zero-sum battle over who gets the finite resources of time and emotional care.
And that battle, which is already so delicate, becomes infinitely more complicated when the fundamental structure of the family fractures. What happens when the ecosystem breaks?
You're talking about the sandwich generation. This is a deeply vulnerable group. We usually define the sandwich generation as adults, typically aged 45 to 65, who are caught right in the middle, sandwiched between caring for their own growing or college-aged children while simultaneously managing the escalating needs of their aging parents.
It is already the most fragile economic and emotional balancing act a human being can attempt. But what happens when that delicate balance is shattered via divorce and remarriage? The U.S. Census data highlights the massive scope of this disruption. In a given year, roughly 26.2% of divorcing men and 18.9% of divorcing women are sitting right in this exact age bracket.
So you are right in the middle of this intense caregiving matrix, providing for everyone above and below you, and suddenly your marriage dissolves. The psychological friction here is unbelievable.
It scrambles the entire social exchange matrix overnight. The rules simply vanish.
Let's really look at the practical, agonizing questions these people suddenly face. Imagine a 55-year-old woman whose 25-year marriage just ended. For the last 10 years, she has been the primary caregiver for her mother-in-law. She took her to every doctor's appointment, bathed her, managed her medications.
Yeah.
The divorce papers are signed. Does that obligation simply vanish into thin air? Does she hand over the sponge and walk away? Does the kinship distance instantly snap from generalized reciprocity back to stranger?
And the guilt associated with that transition is immense. Because you love the person, but the structural tie binding you to them has been severed. And if you remarry, the complexity multiplies exponentially.
Absolutely, because you are blending ledgers. Does my new spouse's existing medical debt threaten my ability to care for my biological aging parents? Do I now have a sudden, unspoken obligation to my new step-siblings or to my new spouse's aging parents who I barely know?
Right.
The ledger goes from a simple 2-column spreadsheet to a terrifying 3-dimensional web of competing loyalties and finite resources.
The emotional resources are stretched beyond capacity, and the financial resources are often legally divided. The sandwich becomes a highly unstable structure.
So what happens when it all falls apart? What happens when the pressure is too high, the resources are depleted, and the biological or cultural drive to reciprocate breaks down entirely? What happens when children simply abandon the ledger?
When social norms and kinship reciprocity completely fail, society has no choice but to step in and legislate it. We can look at a stark example of this with India's Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act of 2007. This is a profound piece of legislation. It essentially takes the unspoken biological social contract of caring for your elders and turns it into enforceable federal law.
How concrete is this? Is it just a formal suggestion from the government?
No. It is highly specific and punitive. Under this act, adult children, and crucially this legally includes sons and daughters-in-law, are legally obligated to pay a monthly allowance to maintain their older relatives who cannot maintain themselves. The state tribunal can literally order them to pay up to 10,000 rupees a month.
So the government is sitting down and mathematically calculating the exact cost of kinship.
Yes. But here is the most fascinating and perhaps shocking legal mechanism embedded in the act. Let's say a senior citizen gifted their house or property to their adult child. They did this under the unspoken assumption, the generalized reciprocity we talked about earlier, that the child would provide basic amenities and physical care in their old age.
Okay.
If the child takes the property, but later fails to provide the care, the state can intervene.
Wait, what authority does the state have over a completed gift?
The state can treat the initial transfer of property as fraudulent. They legally define the gift as having been made under coercion or undue influence because the unspoken contract of care was violated, and they completely void the transfer. The senior citizen legally reclaims the property.
That is astounding. The government essentially looked at the anthropology of the gift, wrote balanced reciprocity into federal law, and enforced it. They looked at a generalized gift, here is my house, please love me and care for me, and said, no, if you do not pay the invisible debt of care, we will forcefully reverse the transaction.
It's incredible.
Are there actual criminal penalties if you refuse?
Yes. The process involves a swift 90-day tribunal, and there is the very real threat of a 3-month prison sentence or a fine for abandoning an elder. When the invisible emotional ledger fails to protect the vulnerable, the state replaces it with a highly visible, deeply punitive ledger.
This is an immense amount to take in. We have traveled through mid-century sociology, European data sets proving money is love, African behavioral experiments on hiding income, Asian American psychological struggles with in-laws, the chaos of American divorce, and the strict punitive laws of India.
We really have.
And I want to pause the data right here. I want to speak directly and very gently to you listening.
This is, without question, the most important part of our deep dive today.
If you are sitting there and you have ever felt completely exhausted by your family, if you have ever felt a hot knot of resentment in your stomach when paying for an in-law's care, if you have ever hidden a bonus from your spouse or kept a secret, quiet bank account just so you could have some tiny sliver of control over your own survival, you are not a bad person. You are not cold. You are not a walking calculator devoid of love.
We need to fundamentally reframe this entire concept of the family ledger, keeping a mental tally of what you give and what you receive. Feeling the heavy weight of those exchanges is not a character flaw. It is a profound, hardwired evolutionary mechanism.
It is literally how we survive as a species.
Yes. Social exchange is how human beings build societies out of nothing. Without the innate ability to track who has contributed to the group and who has taken from it, trust cannot exist.
Right.
Feeling the friction of these exchanges, feeling that tension in your chest when the ledger seems unbalanced, means you are actively, deeply engaged in the delicate human work of maintaining relationships. It means you care about the balance.
You aren't avoiding the reality of your family. You are in the trenches, doing the heavy, unglamorous lifting of keeping the bonds intact. The friction isn't a sign that your family is broken. The friction is the absolute proof that you are connected. This invisible accounting is not a disease. It is not something to fix. It is something to understand. You are not broken. You are human.
And if we pull this idea upward, if we connect to the grander scheme of human history, we can look at the work of anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. He proposed what is known as alliance theory.
What does alliance theory tell us about the broader human picture?
Lévi-Strauss argued that exchanging gifts, and historically this included exchanging kinship ties through marriage across different tribes, is the very foundation of all human trust. Without these reciprocal exchanges, we would have no society at all. We would just be isolated, terrified individuals fending for ourselves. The exchange, the ledger, is the glue of civilization. It is how we learn to trust the stranger.
And we see this ancient principle play out even in the most modern, highly technical aspects of finance. In our research stack, we looked at documentation from Hackard Law, a firm dealing with the complexities of generational wealth transfer.
Yes, the cold legal mechanics of trusts in the States.
Exactly. And what do they find? They point out that wealth transfer almost always fails. Families fracture, lawsuits are filed, siblings stop speaking, when the patriarch or matriarch treats the money as just a math problem. When a parent creates a trust behind closed doors and excludes the beneficiaries from the conversation, they are completely ignoring the social exchange.
Right.
The law firm notes that wealth transfer only works. The family only survives the inheritance when they actively communicate the values and the responsibilities behind the money, when they drag the invisible ledger into the light and acknowledge it.
Because if you just hand over the capital without the context of the relationship, it loses its meaning. It becomes an empty, dangerous transaction. The money must carry the story of the family.
Because money within a family is never just about money. It is the physical language we use to negotiate our deepest, most vulnerable psychological needs. We use it to negotiate love, to establish boundaries against intrusion, to manage our terror of aging and isolation, to demand respect from our peers, to prove our belonging to the pack. Every single time you open your wallet for a family member or accept a check from them, you are fundamentally answering the oldest human question: who belongs to me and who do I belong to?
To briefly summarize our journey today, we have explored the unseen architecture of our lives. We look at how social exchange theory governs our closest bonds, mapping out the true costs and rewards of love. We saw how women negotiate power and survival through income, protecting their families by managing the flow of resources. We examined how profound cultural expectations silently weigh on marriages, creating immense stress and triangulations. And we saw how the law itself must step in when the natural instinct for reciprocity fails.
We covered a lot of ground today, but as we land, I want to leave you with one final, quiet reflection to carry with you. The next time you feel a sudden pang of guilt or a flash of hot frustration over a family obligation, the next time you are sitting at that kitchen table looking at the bank screen, take a breath and ask yourself, what is the invisible currency we are really exchanging right now? Is it respect? Is it safety? Or is it just the deep, aching human need to be seen by the people we love? If this conversation felt true for you, if something in here landed, we would love for you to subscribe to Leone Patterns so you never miss what we explore next. Leave a comment and tell us what these bring up for you. We read every single one. We are building a community here, people who think about money differently. Not as a number to chase, but as a human experience to understand. You are not alone in this, and we are genuinely glad you are here. At Leone Patterns, same pace, same questions. See you then.